Morning. You know, I lived most of my adult life in New England. So there ain't going to be no Colts jersey on this body. We will be celebrating the GOAT next week, so... Greatest of all time, undisputed, greatest quarterback who has ever lived. It's really something that you have to believe if you're going to be a member of this church. Just you know, you just got to understand. See, I'll give you something that'll help you to kind of get inside of that. When I came to Ohio, the thing that I recognized was that people here, not quite, but they almost worship the Buckeyes, right? Right? Yeah, you're just like, it's Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Buckeyes. Well, we're that way in New England because New England is so cold. They don't play football in high school up there. It's so cold that, at least up in Maine, where I was at, it's so cold and everything is so far away that the only professional team that we have is down in Boston, which is like 9 hours from where we live. So that's all we got. So we just, we're thrilled about them. So, All right, time to move on to something important. By the way, and I'll share a little bit more about this, but what we are going to do next week, this is going to be cool. We're going to be having players. Is this a live stream thing? No, it's a video. We're going to be having players from both teams who are playing in the Super Bowl and teams who are not in the Super Bowl who are born-again believers. And they're going to be on screen giving their testimony of Jesus Christ and what he means to their lives. So it's really not going to be about football. It's going to be about Jesus. But we're going to be hearing these players who hold Jesus as number one in their lives. It'll be great week to bring a friend with you, maybe that's not involved in church, somebody maybe that really loves sports to get to hear the testimony of some of these players. It's going to be great. I believe the quarterback from the Eagles is actually going to be speaking. Now, don't root for the Eagles just because of that, but it's going to be a great time together. You know, Jesus made some statements. As you read through the Gospels and study his life, he made some statements that just don't make sense. I mean, you read them and you're left scratching your head thinking, what? Like, for example, he was one time walking on his way and some guy came up to him and testified that he wanted to follow Jesus. And Jesus said, come follow me. And the guy said, well, I want to, but first my father died and I need to go home and I need to bury my father. And then I'll come and I'll follow you. And Jesus said to him, let the dead bury the dead, but you come and follow me. In other words, don't go bury your father. Don't deal with that funeral. He's already dead. He's gone. We got more important things than you grieving your dad. You just come follow me right now. If you're going to follow me, you got to do it now. And we read that and we think, what? Or there was another occasion when Jesus made this statement. In Luke 14:26, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. That's a weird statement. You got to hate everybody that's dear to you if you're going to be his disciple. I mean, there's all kinds of statements that Jesus made that just leave us scratching our head. And so in this series, we're going to look at some of his most confounding statements, things that Jesus said that they don't quite sound right to our Western ears, because we have to climb inside of the Middle Eastern culture really to get what's going on in some of these statements. But even those who lived in that culture, sometimes he would say things and they didn't get it. I mean, the disciples themselves asked Jesus about this. They wanted to know why he was speaking to people the way that he was. And specifically, they asked him, why do you speak in parables? Why do you talk that way to the people? In Matthew chapter 13 and verses 10 through 17, that's where we'll be at today. Right in verse 10, it says that they came to him and it says the disciples said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? Now, a parable is a simple story that is designed to teach a very specific truth. And the disciples knew what a parable was. I mean, they were familiar with that idiom of speech, but they were... the parables weren't real prevalent. I mean, if you look in the Old Testament, you might see one, maybe two parables in all of the Old Testament. And Scholars tell us that Jesus was actually the first person, not just in the biblical world, but in the ancient world at large. He was the very first person to really take the parable method and use that and perfect it. And so he was cutting new ground as he was using that as a primary way of sharing with the crowds. And, if we were to try to attempt to answer that question, why do you speak in parables? We might think that, it was in order to make difficult things easy to understand. Because after all, Jesus used simple ideas from farming to fishing to form his stories. And so he was, we get this idea that he's taking these really complicated spiritual truths and he's bringing it down to our level where we can get it. And that's why the parables are there, to help us to understand these really hard to understand truths. But if that's what we thought, if we figured that's why he spoke that way, we would be mistaken. The disciples were confused by Jesus' parables. It wasn't easier to understand. It became harder to understand for them. In fact, when you read some of his parables, they just don't make any sense. Let me just read one for you. For example, this is just a one-verse parable. In Matthew 13:33, it says, he spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was leavened. End of story. And we say, what does that mean? So Jesus answers this question for them. And what I find interesting is when he answers the question, why do you speak in parables? Because they're confused by that. His answer is actually more confusing than the fact that he's speaking in parables. It's like the answer itself is some kind of a mysterious parable. And let's read it. It's Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 to 17. It says, and the disciples came to him and said, why do you speak to them in parables? Jesus answered them, to you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, you keep on hearing, but will not understand. You keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull. With their ears they scarcely hear, and they have their eyes closed. Otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. Now that's an important answer that Jesus gives the disciples for them and for us too, because it not only reveals why Jesus used parables, but far beyond that, it opens our understanding of Jesus' overall plan. What was Jesus trying to do in his ministry? What was his big idea? What was his mission that he was going on, and how was he introducing that mission to the people at large? So really this answer is important to us. But even before we dive into that, and try to get a handle on what Jesus is saying and why that applies to you and me, what it has to do with our lives, we need to understand a couple of things. First of all, we have to get into the culture of Matthew's readers. Matthew wrote this gospel to a very specific group of people, and they had a particular worldview. They had a mindset. They were viewing life through a particular set of lenses, and so we got to climb inside their head to try to view the world the way they viewed it if we're going to view Matthew the way they viewed Matthew's writing. And then the other thing we have to do is we have to look at what Matthew was trying to do in his gospel. I don't know if you've studied the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but if you've read through them at all, one of the things you'll discover is that they're not the same. In fact, there are 4 different stories about the life of Jesus, but there's a lot of details in between these Gospels that don't match up. Some of them are even contradictory, and some of them are not in the same order. I mean, if you read the Gospels thinking that it's a chronological history of the life of Jesus, you're going to get really confused because some Gospels are completely out of order. Because they weren't attempting to write a chronological, detailed history. That was not the purpose of the gospel. The gospel is about communicating the good news. Gospel means good news. It's presenting Jesus to us, presenting the good news of Jesus. And each of these gospel writers had a very specific audience and a very specific purpose for which they were writing. And they modeled and arranged their story to proclaim that message and to reach the people that they were going after. So let's think for a moment about the people that Matthew was writing. He was addressing a Jewish audience. Not all the Gospels were. Mark and Luke were writing to Gentiles. Matthew was writing to Jewish people, so his message is going to be specifically geared to them. And to the Jewish person who was living in the day of Jesus, there were two major pivot points in their history. If you were in the very first century when Jesus was alive and you were thinking about the history of your nation, there are 2 points that really get your attention. One of those is when they were enslaved to the Egyptians and were led from slavery by Moses and came to become a nation. That's a major part of their history. In fact, every year after that event, they would celebrate a feast called Passover, which was a remembrance of that great event. So it was hugely important in their history. The other pivotal moment in the Jewish mind was when they were taken captive by the Babylonians. They were led out of Egypt by Moses, and they entered into the land of Canaan. They conquered that land. They lived for a number of centuries. But over time, there came a conflict between them and the Babylonian Empire, and the Babylons came in and captured them and removed them from their land and took them as slaves to the land of Babylon. And there they stayed for 70 years. And then eventually they were released and were able to return back to the land. Those are 2 major points in their history as they think about themselves as a nation. All right, well, in Jesus' days, the Jews weren't in captivity, but they were under the rule of the Romans. The Romans, when they conquered the land, they didn't do like the Babylonians. The Babylonians would conquer their enemies, gather them all up, kill the soldiers, take the women, take the children, and they would put them in chains and haul them back to their land, and they would become slaves in their land. But when Rome built its empire, it did it a little bit differently. It would go into a territory and conquer it and let the people stay there. And then they would bring their armies and their leaders in, and they would colonize it so that that became a colony of Rome, and they would control that area, letting the people live in their own territory. So the Jews are living in their land. They're keeping their customs, but they are under Roman control. So they're free, but they're not really free. One writer I was reading said that it's like, let's say you went away on vacation, and while you were gone, somebody came in and squatted in your home, and they took up residence in your home, and you come back to your home, and you're home, but you're not really home until you get rid of them, and they're out of your house. As long as they're in your house, you may be there, but you're not really home. And that's how it was for them. They came back into their land, but now the Romans are controlling it for them. And so the Jews were looking for a deliverer. And Matthew is writing to say that Jesus is that deliverer. The great hero of the Jewish people was Moses. He's that one who led them from Egyptian slavery into freedom, where they actually became a great nation. So he's their hero. And so Matthew is writing his gospel and he's casting Jesus as the new Moses. And he's saying Jesus is now our Moses, and he is leading us from slavery. He's leading us from captivity. And as you read through that, the Gospel of Matthew, keeping that in mind, there's all kinds of parallels that are there between the Gospel of Matthew and the book of Exodus, the story of the Israelites and Moses coming out of Egypt. And Matthew did that intentionally. Moses, for example, we read, escaped from the hand of Pharaoh when Pharaoh had said that all of the baby boys born were going to be thrown into the Nile River and killed. And yet Moses was put into an ark, into a basket, and his life was spared. Herod wanted to kill all of the baby boys in Bethlehem for fear that somebody would threaten his throne. And so Jesus was spared from that destruction because God spoke to Joseph in a dream, and they left for Egypt that very evening. And so there's a parallel between those two. Eventually, they came from Joseph and Mary, and baby Jesus came back from Egypt, and the writers of the Bible draw a parallel between that and when Israel came out of Egypt and came to their land. And for example, in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, the prophet said, "When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Talking about God taking Israel and calling Israel out of Egyptian slavery. Well, in Matthew 2:15, Matthew writes, he remained there, Jesus, meaning Jesus, Joseph, and Mary are now in Egypt, and it says, he remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So Matthew's drawing this parallel. When Moses was called by God to deliver the people of Israel from Egypt, God said to him in Exodus 4:19, "Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead." Pharaoh and all of them are dead. When Joseph was commanded to bring Jesus and Mary back into the promised land, in Matthew 2:19 it says, "But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother, go into the land of Egypt." Now look at this phrase, "For all those who sought the child's life are dead." All those who seek your life, Moses, are dead. All those who sought the child's life are dead. There's this parallel that's being drawn. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years to be tested by the Lord. Jesus wandered in the wilderness for 40 days to be tested by the Lord. Moses came down from Mount Sinai to give the law to the Israelites. The Torah, the commandments were given to them. Jesus delivers his sermon to the people on the mount that we call the Sermon of the Mount, giving them the law on a mountain. And in that sermon, he quotes from the Torah 6 times. Moses led the Israelites in keeping the Passover year after year after year. Jesus in the upper room shared the meal with them, that Passover meal, but Jesus said, "Now this is a new meal that I'm initiating with you." So Matthew's drawing all of these parallels between them. He's making it clear that Jesus came to deliver the Jews from captivity. In fact, he gives us a huge clue in the opening of his gospel. You know, Matthew starts his story with a genealogy, which, you know, if you're wanting to write a bestseller, that's not the best way to begin a story, because it's all of these begats. You know, Shealtiel begat Zerubbabel, and he had so many children, and they lived so long, and Zerubbabel begat, you know, all these names that nobody can pronounce. And it's just all of these, so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, and you just don't even make it past the first chapter. This is boring. You don't want to read it. But genealogies were super important to the Jewish people because heritage and history were everything to them. So he's connecting Jesus to King David. He's connecting Jesus to Abraham and that line and all those who are important in the faith. But he does something in the genealogy that does not occur in genealogies. This is really unique. If you look in Matthew 1:11 and 12, it says, Josiah became the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of, and look at this, the deportation to Babylon. He mentions this time when they were deported to Babylon. And then it says in verse 12, after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah became the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel. And then if you skip down to verse 17, it says, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. From the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So he's mentioning this being deported into Babylon 4 different times. That's not done in genealogies. And so that tells us that Matthew is up to something. Matthew wants his readers to understand that Jesus was coming as the new Moses to deliver his people. Jesus himself preached that the new kingdom was at hand. In Matthew 4:17 it says, from that time Jesus began to preach and say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But it was a completely different kind of kingdom than what they were expecting. They were expecting somebody to come and bring a political kingdom, to bring a military kingdom, to overthrow the Romans. And that's not what Jesus was coming to do. In fact, when he was being tried and was standing with Pilate, the Roman governor, Pilate asked him about this, about his kingdom and being a king and all of that. And Jesus made this statement. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. He said, if my kingdom were of this world, my soldiers would be fighting right now. But they're not, because my kingdom is not that kind of a kingdom. It's a different kind of a kingdom. This would not be a kingdom that would conquer its enemies. Instead, this would be a kingdom that would love its enemies. And that was radical. When Jesus was on the mount in Galilee, as a picture of Sinai, now he's on the mountain in Galilee giving what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's what we would call a kingdom manifesto. He's laying out for them what the kingdom is going to be like. And he mentions the Torah several times. You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, love your enemies. He's saying, now look, I'm redesigning this thing. This is going to be a whole different kind of kingdom. Let me just pull an excerpt out of that sermon in Matthew 5:39. It says, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. That's striking right at the heart of where those people were living, because they were controlled by the Roman government, and there was conscription laws that said if there was a load that needed to be carried, the Romans could force a person to carry their load for 1 mile, and you had to agree to do that. And so he's really talking about the Romans coming in and poking their nose in their business and forcing them to live a way they didn't want to live. And he says, hey, when they ask you to go 1 mile, do it. Actually, go 2. That's not what they wanted to hear. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. They don't want to hear that. They think God's going to cause the sun to rise on Israel, but he's going to bring torment and darkness and storm to the Romans. And he's saying, no. God's going to show kindness and goodness to everybody. This kingdom would invite all people to become a part of it. That's what Jesus meant when he told the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember when the religious ruler asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus said to him, well, let me tell you a story about this guy who was wandering, going from Jericho to Jerusalem, and he fell among thieves, and he's knocked on the side of the road, and he's left for dead. And a Levite comes, a very religious Jewish man comes and sees him on the side of the road. And goes to the other side and quickly makes his way. Doesn't want to get involved, you know. And then a scribe comes, another religious Jewish leader, and he sees him, and he does the same thing. And then this Samaritan comes down the road. Now, a Samaritan, you got to understand, is not a Jewish person. He's outside the Jewish culture. Let me put it in perspective to you. Let's go back to the South in 1961. And the guy on the side of the road is a white man, and the Samaritan is a black man. That's kind of the ethnic, cultural dissonance that Jesus is creating in this story. So this Samaritan is coming down the road, and he sees this man who's been beaten up, and he goes over and he fixes his wounds, and he takes him to an inn, and he gives him medicine, and he pays the innkeeper money, and he says to the innkeeper, hey, take care of him, and if there's anything else that needs to be done, you let me know, and I'll pay the difference when I come back on business again. And he goes on his way. And then Jesus turns to this Jewish religious leader, and he says, you tell me, who was the neighbor? And he can't even say the word. He can't say the Samaritan, because he hates Samaritans. He's a Jew. He said, the one who showed him kindness. And what Jesus was saying is, your neighbor is not just your fellow Jew. That's not who you love. You love the Samaritan. You love the black. You love the white. You love the poor. You love this person who lives differently, believes differently, is in a whole different group. The kingdom is about spreading your arms to everybody. Oh, they didn't want to hear that. They did not want to hear that message. You see, what the Jews had missed is that was always God's intention from the beginning. When God first started the Jewish nation under Abraham, in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, when the original promise of God is being given to the Jewish nation, God said to Abraham, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. All of them. Not just the Jews. The entire world will be blessed. Well, there was a huge problem with Jesus' message. Okay? Jesus is going to preach this message, and as he's unfolding it, people reacted in one of two extremes. They were in the ditches. One extreme was that they interpreted what he was saying as their moment to see a political uprising. So Jesus is teaching all day on the mount, and it's getting late, and everybody's getting hungry, and the disciples come to him and they say, look, man, everybody's a long ways away from any place to get anything to eat. The sun is going down. These people are hungry. What are we going to do? And Jesus said, well, you tell me, what are you going to do? And the long story short, he receives a couple of loaves of bread and some fish, and he divides the bread and he divides the fish, and he gives it to the disciples, and they pass it out. And there's 5,000 men plus women and children. So they got a couple of loaves for thousands of people. And the bread and the fish just keep dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing. And so this bread from heaven is being multiplied. Again, it's a picture of the manna that the Jews had in the book of Exodus. And when the people experienced that miracle, we're told in the Gospels that they rallied around Jesus when it was done, and they tried to forcibly make him king. This is the guy. He's going to help us overthrow the Romans. So that was one extreme. We're going to make him king. And Jesus had to get rid of his disciples because they were chiming in on that. They were all part of it. So he made them get in the boat and go out to the sea, and he dispersed the crowds. So that was one problem. They go to this extreme. They're going to make him king so he can overthrow the Romans. Then there was the opposite reaction. When he's in his own hometown and he's preaching in Nazareth, he's talking about God's desire to reach those outside the Jewish community. And he tells them this story. He says, when the famine came to the land in the days of Elijah, the great prophet of Israel, he did not go and heal any of the daughters of the sons of Israel, but instead he went up to Tyre and to Sidon, and those are the people that he healed. In other words, he was willing to step outside of Jerusalem where there was all kinds of unbelief and said, forget you people. And your great prophet went outside the Jewish community and he was ministering to those who were part of a different culture, part of a different group. And they got so mad at what Jesus said that they literally gathered him up and carried him to the edge of the cliff in Nazareth and were going to throw him over the cliff and kill him because he would dare to proclaim a message that says, let's open our arms beyond ourselves and love other people. And so there were those two extremes of either wanting to kill him or wanting to make him king. So Jesus needed to be strategic in how he unfolded his plan. And that's why he speaks in parables, to introduce the message of the kingdom. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 34, it says, all these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, and he did not speak to them without a parable. That's how he started. He changed. There was a point at which he changed his message, and everything was being spoken through parables. He taught in parables to hide his message because his message was subversive. He was breaking down racial barriers and saying that God's plan is to bring the message through the Jews to the entire world. And that didn't mean that the people, in order to receive the message, had to become Jewish. They could still remain Gentile, non-Jew, but receive the message. The kingdom is bigger than your sectarian Judaism. So when Jesus began to unfold the message of a radical, subversive kingdom, he used parables. And here's the reason why. A parable is not a simple story with an easy application. The truth is hidden, and it has to be discovered. Someone could hear, the story and think it's interesting, and then they could just walk away. Only those who were truly interested, truly hungry for truth, would ponder what he was saying. Now let's put ourselves in the shoes of the average person in Jesus' time. You live in Galilee and you hear that Jesus is coming to your town, and so you go out and you hear him and he shares several parables, and in fact that's all he shares is parables, and you really don't get what he's saying. Now in our day, if we read a parable and we don't get anything out of it, we just turn the page. Well, let's go to Ephesians. I like that book. We'll do that. But they couldn't do that. It was an oral tradition. They didn't have Bibles. And, you might not ever hear Jesus speak another time in your entire lifetime. He comes to your town this one time. So if you heard him and you were hungry for God, you'd ponder what he said. And you'd remember what he said because it was in story form. And so you would think about the story until you saw the real meaning. So he was putting it out there for people who were truly hungry for truth. They're the ones who would discover the real meaning. But here's the real genius of Jesus' method. He knew that something more than just that would happen. It wasn't just about understanding the truth. There was something deeper. Parables were stories. And story is a powerful means of communication. And we get that. That's how people learn today. For example, many people acquire their worldview through television. Right? The average American watches 5 hours of television a night. And they're watching more than just entertaining shows. Worldviews are being shaped by those shows. But the TV personalities, they're not just standing there preaching to them, but they're sharing their philosophies through story. And they use the story as the medium of indoctrination. Let me just show you what I mean by that. A couple of weeks ago, I was watching an episode of Madam Secretary. Any of you ever watched that show? Madam Secretary. It's about a female Secretary of State. She's working for this president. He would be on the political spectrum on the liberal side. And something happens that from Russia, there's a perceived threat from Russia. And so the president is really angry about this, and he goes on television and he makes this outlandish speech that he threatens to send missiles on them and destroy them. And is making the comments that their ability to strike with military force is greater than Russia's. Eventually, the show dissolves to the point where he actually orders his armed forces to shoot missiles at all of the Russian satellites and knock them out of the sky. And his cabinet is beside themselves. They tried to reason with him. He won't listen to them. They tried to reason with him. He fired one of them right on the spot because they wouldn't listen. And so they got together secretly and they decided something's wrong with him. This is not normal. He must be mentally ill. We've got to do something. So they invoked the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is where the president is unfit to serve, and they removed him from office. And then they got him to a doctor, and it was discovered he had a tumor that was growing in his brain, and it was pushing against a part of his brain that was affecting his decision to make, his ability to make decisions. So they removed the tumor. He went back to himself, and he got reinstated into office. It was kind of a neat show, but you know what the real story was? President Trump is a crazy guy who's saying to North Korea, our missiles are bigger than yours. We've got more missiles on our ships than you do in your whole country. We will blow you out of the sky. And this side over here is saying he must be mentally ill to be saying things like that. And the only logical response is we need to impeach him and get him out of office. That's really the message of that show. Whether you agree with that or don't agree with that, that's not my point. My point is they preach a doctrine through their stories, right? Because stories are powerful. Because stories do more than inform the mind. They touch the heart. They move us deep inside. When Disney brought out the movie Bambi into the theaters, you know deer hunting went down that year? Because moms and children didn't want dad going out and killing Bambi's mom. It actually did. Jesus uses parables to introduce the kingdom to those interested in heart change because he knew that that's how a revolution begins. That they ponder that truth and then that story gets inside their heart and touches them emotionally and it changes them at a heart level. And those are the people who become the components who help bring forward a revolution. Only those hungry for God would ponder it. And those who pondered the story, it would get inside them and it would change them and shape them. So it wasn't only about ideas. It was about heart change. And that means that Jesus isn't only interested in us having all the right answers and all the right categories. It's not about having perfect theology. He's interested in heart change. You can answer all the questions in a Bible trivia game, but your heart can be far away from God. The kingdom of God isn't about learning all the answers. It's about letting the truth sink deep into your heart until it changes how you live. And we make the mistake every day because we think that if we believe the right things, if we hold the correct doctrines, then we're in. In fact, when leading someone to Jesus, people have sometimes run through a list of things that these people need to believe. And if they tick off all the right boxes, we say they're in. The problem is, how do you define what ought to be on that list? There are 30,000 denominations, Christian denominations in the world today, 30,000 of them. And they all thought that theirs was important enough that they would actually split away from the prior group that they were a part of. Because they have the list, and their list is correct. And the splitting wasn't cordial. In the early days, it led to bloodshed. They killed one another. Martin Luther comes forward and he nails those 95 statements on the Wittenberg door because he's protesting what's going on in the church at large, the Catholic Church, and they oppose him and they hunt him down and they try to kill him, and they kill many people who are in that movement. And we say, oh, bad Catholics, look what they're doing to these Lutherans. But then a group rises up called the Anabaptists, and their group have the audacity to believe that you got baptized as an infant, but really it didn't mean anything because you didn't know what was going on. So now that you're an adult, you can get baptized again. That's what Anabaptist means, baptized again. The Lutherans said that is horrible, and they hunted the Anabaptists down, and they killed several of them. So the Catholics are killing the Lutherans, and the Lutherans are killing the Anabaptists, and they're all fighting one another, drawing blood, all of these different groups, because you have a different list than I do, and therefore we have to force you to conform to our list, and if you don't, we will draw blood. That's the history of the church. But being right with God can't be narrowed down to believing in a set of doctrines. Parables are a careful way to introduce a subversive message, because the kingdom is not about doctrine, it's about relationships. And we're still not getting it. That's why the Crusades rose up. And in the name of Jesus, armies went to Jerusalem, encountered the Saracens, we call them Muslims, and slaughtered them. You either become a Christian or we will kill you by the sword. Today we do the same thing. Maybe not quite that way, but we separate ourselves from those who are different than us. Push them away. Come ye therefore out from among them, and be ye separate. We love that verse. You know the most segregated time in all of North America is on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. White congregation. Right? And if you went to a black congregation, it would pretty much be black congregation. And that's just not here. That is all over the entire country. There's a few churches where you see a mix of people from many different places around the world. But most of North American churches are segregated. We do us, you do you. Let's leave each other alone. And we separate ourselves from those who are different than us in every way. They're a different religion, stay completely away from them. They have different beliefs, stay completely. They're transgender, they're part of the LGBTQ community, stay away from them, have nothing to do with them. That's what we say. A few years ago, you heard the story in the news about the couple who owned a bakery. And a gay couple came to them and wanted them to bake them a cake. It's their political right to say no. And so they said no. And then a lawsuit ensued. And it became a huge political hot potatoes. Everybody's arguing over that. And this couple, they lost their business. And I would say probably today that they would view the gay community as the enemy. Somewhere, somebody said that our battle's not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers. I was thinking about that. I was thinking, what would have happened if that couple would have baked that cake and taken it to the wedding and maybe befriended them and been kind to them? Not saying, hey, we're all for gay marriage. Just, you know what, we love you. And through that relationship, maybe built a bridge of relationship that would open up the door to have conversations about Jesus and let Jesus be the one who sorts those things out. Here's the thing I don't get. People will make that, what they did is they took something of the kingdom and they turned it into politics. And I see, forgive me for being critical, but I see some real inconsistencies there, because I will not bake a cake for you because you two are gay. But you two, man and woman, are coming into my shop and you're living together in sexual sin. You're committing infidelity, which is against the commandments of God, but no problem. I'll bake you a cake all day. Meaning this sin is worse than that sin. You see the inconsistency in that? We need to love them to Jesus. Love the Samaritan. Love the Roman. Love the person of a different color. Love the person of a different religion who has a different views. Love them to Jesus, because the way of the kingdom is about crossing social and religious and ethnic lines. The kingdom does not conquer by the sword, it conquers by love. I was listening to a testimony some couple of years ago now about a Muslim man who was a terrorist. And he immigrated into this nation, and his plan was to come, get into the culture, and he was going to blow himself up and kill as many people as he could. That was his plan. He'd been trained to do that, and he'd come to do that. But he was telling his story because this Christian family brought him in and had him live with them. They never preached to him. They never tried to convince him that Islam was wrong and Christianity was right. They didn't do any of that. They just loved him. They didn't judge him, nothing. They loved him. And it really messed with his head, because he had never seen that before. He had never seen unconditional love. And it spoke so powerfully to him that he thought, something's real about what they have, and I want it. And he ended up giving his life to Jesus Christ. And he threw away all his terrorist ideas. And today, and this is why I heard him telling his story, he goes all over the Muslim world preaching Jesus in meetings around the world. They didn't love him with argument, with debate, with saying, stay away from us, you're Muslim, we want nothing to do with you. They reached him with love. And then they let Jesus be the one that takes care of what's going on inside the heart. Jesus wants us to join us in his kingdom. But his message is subversive, because he wants us to reach out to those who are unlike us and not share judgment, but love. But that's how a revolution will begin. I guess my question is, do you want to be part of the revolution? I don't want to be the Pharisee that goes down the road and doesn't pay attention to the guy that's on the side of the road. I don't want to be the Pharisee who says, let's have nothing to do with them. Let's not do that. You know what? Jesus went to parties where there were prostitutes and sinners and all kinds of sexual deviancy, all kinds of drunkenness, all kinds of wrong that was going on. And he spent his time there. And the religious community actually criticized him because he was, as a matter of fact, they called him a drunk. They saw, well, he's hanging out with drunks and people that are drinking. He must be a drunk too. And they claimed that he was a drunk. And Jesus said this, look, I didn't come to call the righteous, like you people who are so righteous. I came to call those who are sick. I'm a physician, and I need to be where those are who are hurting and who are needy and who are hungry. And so he was saying, don't isolate yourself into your own community of a religious bubble, and you say we want nothing to do with anybody that's unlike us. Now reach out and be like Jesus. Be the hands and the feet and the mouth of Jesus to those who are unlike us, and watch the love of God touch a heart and draw people into relationship with him. We're going to take communion in just a couple of minutes. I'm done. My rant is over. But communion is a subversive practice. You know, Passover was for the Jews only. You, as a Jew, would follow the Passover meal every year in commemoration of what happened with Moses. But when they were in the upper room, Jesus opened this up to everybody. This is going to be bread and juice that everyone can be a part of, that represents Jesus breaking down the barriers to where the New Testament letters would say in Christ there is no male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free. We're all coming together into one family in this reconciling, powerful work of Jesus Christ. And so today we're Gentiles, we're non-Jews, and we are invited to the covenant table. And everyone who eats of the bread and drinks of the cup is engaging in a celebration of a kingdom that transcends barriers. When you take that bread and you take that cup, you were on the outside. All of us were. We were Gentiles. And we're saying, look, he included us. So as I drink this cup and as I eat this bread, I want to have that same kingdom mindset, that I'm not going to become prejudiced. I'm not going to become closed off, even if they believe differently than me, even if they think differently, if they have a worldview that's 180 degrees out of phase with where I'm at in my worldview, I'm still going to love them because they're people. And Jesus loves them as much as he loves you. And so we want to reach out to them. They're not the enemy. They're just people who need the love of Jesus in their life. And I want to be a part of that kind of kingdom. They're going to come and pass out the elements to you. We'll sing while they're doing that. Hang on to the bread and the juice, and then we'll take them all together at the same time.